okay, called metabolic syndrome. I'm going to show you how fructose does every one of those. I want to show you the difference between glucose and fructose in a way that will be glaringly apparent. So let's consume 120 calories in glucose. 2 slices of white bread. Okay? What happens to that 120 calories? Now, you eat the 120 calories, 96 or 80% of the total will be used by all the organs in the body. Okay? 80% off the table. Why? Because every cell in the body can use glucose. Every bacteria can use glucose. Every living thing on the face of the earth can use glucose because glucose is the energy of life. Okay? That's what we were supposed to eat. Okay? 24 of those calories, or 20%, will hit the liver. Okay? So let's watch what happens to those 24 calories. Here they go. So the glucose comes in through this transporter called GLUT2. Out here, the glucose is going to stimulate the pancreas to make insulin. The insulin is going to bind to its receptor, and it's going to take this substrate over here called IRS1, insulin receptor substrate 1. That's not important right now, don't worry, okay? And it's going to tyrosine phosphorylate it, okay? And it's going to be tyrosine IRS1, which is now active. That's active. And it's going to stimulate the second messenger here called AKT. Okay? Now, what AKT does is it stimulates this guy down here, SREBP1, sterol receptor binding protein number 1. Don't worry about it, okay? But this is the thing that ultimately gets fat mechanics going, okay? So you'll see in a minute. So one of the things that SREBP1 does is it activates this enzyme here called glucokinase, which takes glucose to glucose 6-phosphate. Now, glucose 6-phosphate can't get out of the liver. The only way to get glucose 6-phosphate out of the liver is with hormones, glucagon or epinephrine. That's the way you can get it out. So now the glucose is fixed in the cell, but it's only 24 calories worth. So it's not a big, bolus of it. Okay? Now, the glucose 6-phosphate, almost all of it is going to end up going over here to something called glycogen. Now, glycogen is the storage form of glucose in the liver, okay? Because glycogen is easy to fish the glucose out with glucagon and epinephrine. So my question to you, and granted this is a physiology question, is how much glycogen can your liver store before it gets sick? The answer is any amount. It's unlimited. Okay? We have carb loaders who run marathons, right? Okay? Does it hurt them at all? We have kids with a disease where they can't get the glucose out of the glycogen called glycogen storage disease type 1A, or von Gierke's disease. They got livers down to their knees, they're so big. They're hypoglycemic like all get out because they can't lift the glucose out of their liver. Okay? But they don't go into liver failure. Because glycogen is a non-toxic storage form of glucose in the liver. So the whole goal of glucose is to replete your glycogen. So this is good. This is not bad. This is good. Now, a little of that glucose is going to fall down here. It's going to get metabolized down to this stuff here called pyruvate. And the pyruvate is going to enter your mitochondria over here. Remember, your mitochondria are the parts of your cell that actually burn the energy. They're your little factories. Okay? They make the stuff that lets you live. Okay, called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That's the energy of life right there. Okay, so the pyruvate comes in, gets converted to something called acetyl-CoA, gets metabolized by this thing called the Krebs cycle, TCA cycle, and you throw off ATP and carbon dioxide, which you breathe off. So far, so good? Have I snowed anybody yet? You're with me? I snowed one guy back there. Okay, I'm doing my best. I swear to God, I'm doing my best. Anyway, so this stuff over here, this acetyl-CoA, gets burned off in the TCA cycle. Now, maybe you won't burn all of it off, and so some of it may exit as citrate, okay? And the citrate then leaves the mitochondria through a process known as the citrate shuttle, and then that citrate can then be broken down by these 3 enzymes, which are all subservient to this SREBP1. This is ATP citrate lyase, acetyl-CoA carboxylase, fatty acid synthase. They're not important. The only thing to know is these 3 enzymes together turn sugar into fat. Okay? This is called de novo, meaning new, lipogenesis, fat making. Okay? This is de novo lipogenesis. So you take the citrate, which came from the glucose, okay, and you end up with something called acyl-CoA, which then gets packaged with this protein here, and you end up with something called VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. Now, anybody heard of that before? Is it good or bad? It's bad. That's bad. Okay? VLDL is bad because that's one of the things that causes heart disease. It's also a substrate for obesity. Okay? So you don't want to make much of this. Okay? But the point is, You started with 24 calories, maybe a half a calorie will end up as VLDL. So that little Japanese guy with the little hat, working out in the field, eating rice for the next, 90 years, can he die of a heart attack at age 90? Sure. Okay? But that's not so bad. Okay? If you make it to 90, you're doing all right. Okay? Because of that VLDL coming from glucose. Okay? Glucose made a little bitty VLDL. Okay? And that serves as a substrate for adipose deposition into your fat cell here, triglyceride. In addition, because the insulin went up in response to the glucose, your brain sees that signal, and it knows that that is supposed to shut off further eating. Okay? In other words, hey, I'm busy metabolizing my breakfast. I don't need lunch. Okay? And so you have a nice negative feedback loop between glucose consumption, the liver, the pancreas, and the brain to keep you in normal negative yin-yang energy balance. This is good. This is not dangerous. This is what's supposed to happen. All right, so now let's talk about a different carbohydrate. Let's talk about my favorite carbohydrate, maybe yours too. Okay, ethanol. Ethanol is a carbohydrate, isn't it? Here's the structure, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. It's a carbohydrate. But we all know that ethanol is a toxin, right? A poison, right? You can wrap your Lamborghini around a tree, or you can fry your liver. Your choice. Depends on how much you drink and how often, right? Okay. So we know that ethanol is not good for you, except, of course, a little bit is good for you, right? So we can talk about that too later if you want. Okay? But let's talk about how it's bad for you. So here's acute ethanol exposure. Okay? CNS depression, vasodilatation, hypothermia, tachycardia, myocardial depression, pupillary responses, respiratory depression, diuresis, hypoglycemia, loss of fine motor control. You all went to college. Here's fructose. Nothing. Doesn't do any of those because the brain doesn't metabolize fructose. Okay? Alcohol gets metabolized in the brain to cause all of those things, but fructose doesn't. Okay? So fructose is not an acute toxin. Ethanol is. We control ethanol, don't we? Okay? We have something called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, right? We have all sorts of things. We tax ethanol. We do all sorts of things to limit consumption of ethanol. Okay? The Nordic countries, okay, all the liquor stores are state-run in an attempt to try to set the price of ethanol high enough so as to discourage consumption for public health reasons. We have 1,500 years of alcohol control policy in this world to draw on in terms of how to limit consumption. Got it? Okay? Because ethanol is a toxin and we know it. So let's consume 120 calories in ethanol. Shot of Maker's Mark. Anybody taste it? Yeah, good. Okay. So 24 calories right off the top. Okay? The stomach and the intestine have something called the first pass effect. So 10% off the top. And kidney, muscle, and brain will consume the other 10%. So there goes 20% or 24 calories right off the top. 96 calories of the 120 are going to hit the liver. Now, how many was it for glucose? It was 24. Okay? So 4 times the substrate is going to hit the liver. And there's the rub. Okay? This is a volume issue. Okay? We're going to show you how. So the ethanol comes in, passive diffusion, there's no receptor for it, no transporter. First thing that happens is ethanol gets converted to this guy over here called acetaldehyde. Okay? Anybody know anything about aldehydes? Like formaldehyde? Right? Are aldehydes good for you or bad for you? They're bad, right? Because what do? They can cause cancer. They cross-link proteins is what they do. Okay? So if you cross-link enough proteins in your liver, what do you think happens to it? You get something called cirrhosis. Right, exactly. All right? So this guy over here is bad. Okay? And it generates something called reactive oxygen species. And reactive oxygen species damage proteins in the liver. And the more alcohol you drink, the more of this stuff you get. So far, so good? Okay, so this is one of the reasons why alcohol is bad. Now, the acetaldehyde will come down here to something called acetate. Okay, the acetate will enter the mitochondria, just like the pyruvate did before, will get converted to acetyl-CoA and participate in the TCA cycle just like before, okay, to generate energy, so that alcoholics don't die from lack of energy. They got energy, it's everything else they don't have, okay? They're going to have a whole lot of citrate, right? Because they have 96 calories that have to get metabolized. How many calories made it to the mitochondria with glucose? About a half, right? Because most of it went to glycogen. Okay? So we've got a big citrate, so it's in big font to show you that we've talked about big citrate now. Okay? And so the big citrate is going to get metabolized all the way to VLDL by this SRBP1. And so you're going to get a lot of VLDL. And this is the dyslipidemia of alcoholism right here. Okay? Everybody see that? So the liver's going to try to export this VLDL out so that it doesn't get sick, because when fat builds up in the liver, that's not good for it. Okay? Some of it's going to exit as free fatty acids, and those free fatty acids will take up residence in the muscle, and you get something called muscle insulin resistance. So insulin resistance, that's a bad thing. That makes your muscles and your liver not work so well, okay? And can cause all sorts of other problems like diabetes. Some of the acyl-CoA won't even make it out and will precipitate as a lipid droplet. So there's your alcoholic steatohepatitis. This acyl-CoA and this ethanol and these reactive oxygen species can start this enzyme activated. Okay, it's called C-Jun N-terminal kinase 1, or JUNK1, and it really is JUNK1 because it is the bridge between metabolism and inflammation. So when you generate JUNK1, you do bad things to your liver, which I will show you when we talk about fructose. So let's talk about fructose. Okay? Fructose is sweet. We like it a lot. Okay? We like it in everything. We like it in our bread. We like it in our pretzels. We like it everywhere we look. Okay? So let's consume 120 calories in sucrose, a glass of orange juice. Everybody got it? So 2 slices of white bread, a shot of Maker's Mark, a glass of orange juice. All the same 120 calories, but 3 different substrates. Let's see what happens to the fructose. So, number 1, the glucose, remember, because sucrose is half glucose, half fructose. So 60 of the calories of the 120 are glucose. 12 are going to make it into the liver, 48 out here for the rest of the body. Okay, the same 20-80 split we had before with glucose. So far, so good. But all 60 calories of fructose are going to be metabolized by the liver. Why? Because only the liver can metabolize fructose. So what do we call it, where when you take in a compound that's foreign to your body, and only the liver can metabolize it, and in the process generates various problems? What do we call that? We call that a poison. So let me show you how it's a poison. So let's watch the fructose. So the fructose comes in through this transporter now. Before it was GLUT2, now it's GLUT5. Okay? No insulin, remember, because fructose does not stimulate insulin. The fructose then gets metabolized by this guy over here called fructokinase to form something called fructose 1-phosphate. In the process, ATP has to give up 1-phosphate to ADP because the phosphate has to come from somewhere. So it comes from here. Now, before we had 24 calories that had to be phosphorylated. Now we have 72 calories that have to be phosphorylated. So we have 3 times the substrate, and there's the rub. It's a volume issue for right now. So we're going to lose a lot of phosphate, aren't we? So there's a scavenger enzyme in your liver called AMP deaminase 1 to rescue the phosphates off the rest of the ATP molecule. And it takes ADP down to AMP, adenosine monophosphate, down to IMP, inositol monophosphate, and finally to the waste product, uric acid. Anybody ever heard of uric acid? What is it? It's a waste product. It goes out in your urine. Causes what disease? Gout, right. Okay? It also causes another disease called hypertension. Okay, let me show you how. Because uric acid, turns out, blocks the enzyme in your blood vessels called endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And that's the enzyme that makes this stuff called nitric oxide, NO. And that is your endogenous blood pressure lowerer. That keeps your blood pressure low. So when you can't make it, your blood pressure goes up. So this just shows that fructose consumption increases gout in adults. Okay, so this is a study that came out last year showing that fructose consumption increases the risk for gout, showing that uric acid's going up. And this is a study done by our pediatric renal fellow, Stephanie Wynn, just published in Journal of Pediatrics. Okay, it's not submitted anymore, it's long in press. Okay, showing that this is in the NHANES database in the adolescents, showing that sugar-sweetened beverages, as it goes up, your uric acid goes up. And not only does your uric acid go up, but here's your